In the Bow of Ulysses, James Anthony Froude traveled from island to island and compared and contrasted them. Some were prosperous and some were not. Some had self-government and some did not. All had a history of slavery, and in all these islands the blacks were happy. Froude spends a large part of the book writing about slavery and its legacy. He argued that the descendants of slaves in the Caribbean were significantly better off than their cousins in Africa. For instance, quote, "Meanwhile, they are perfectly happy. In no part of the globe is there any peasantry whose every want is so completely satisfied as Her Majesty's black subjects in these West Indian islands. They have no aspirations to make them restless. They have no guilt upon their consciences. They have food for the picking up, clothes they need not, and lodging in such a climate need not be elaborate. They have perfect liberty, and are safe from dangers, for the English rule prevents the strong from oppressing the weak. In their own country, they would have remained slaves to more warlike races. In the West Indies, their fathers underwent a bondage of a century or two, lighter at its worst than the easiest form of it in Africa. Their descendants in return have nothing now to do save to laugh and sigh and enjoy existence." So, in societies across the West, we're told of the inhumanity and greed of slavery. But the upside isn't ever talked about. Aren't African Americans actually much better off than Africans are today? Wasn't that even true during segregation? If you're looking at wealth and even opportunity, you would have to say that African Americans are better off. From another perspective, you have to wonder about dignity. Maybe Africans would rather be first-class citizens in a third-world country than second-class citizens in a first-world country. And you could make that argument, but at the same time, you don't see many African Americans going back to Africa. But ultimately, you can argue against slavery in a few different ways. One of the main problems people have with it is the cruelty. We show our children old photos of old men with scarred backs, and fictional movies where white slave owners whip their slaves to death or rape their slave women, and no one likes cruelty. Froude makes an effort to downplay the cruelty of slavery. Quote, "As life goes, he has been a lucky mortal. He was taken away to be a slave indeed, but a slave to a less cruel master than he would have found at home. He had a bad time of it occasionally, and the plantation whip and the branding irons are not all dreams. Yet his owner cared for him at least as much as he cared for his cows and his horses. Kind usage to animals is more economical than barbarity, and Englishmen in the West Indies were rarely inhuman." That's a pretty common argument, that slave owners weren't unnecessarily cruel. He actually makes the argument that blacks were better off under slavery than under the current system, in the 1880s, of plantations where blacks worked for money. Quote, "The personal influence of the white man over the black, which might have been brought about by a friendly intercourse after slavery was abolished, was never so much as attempted. A Negro can be attached to his employer at least as easily as a horse or a dog. The horse or dog requires kind treatment, or becomes indifferent or sullen. So it is with the Negro. But the forced equality of the races before the law made more difficult the growth of any kindly feeling. To the overseer on a plantation, the black laborer was a machine out of which the problem was to get the maximum of work with the minimum of pay. In the slavery times, the horse and dog relation was a real thing. The master and mistress joked and laughed with their dark bondsmen, knew Caesar from Pompeii, knew how many children each had, gave them small presents, cared for them when they were sick, and maintained them when they were old and past work. All this ended with emancipation. Between whites and blacks no relations remained, save that of employer and employed. They lived apart. They had no longer, save in exceptional instances, any personal communication with each other. The law refusing to recognize a difference, the social line was drawn the harder, which the law was unable to reach." One argument that's under the surface there, that's also made in other parts of the book, is the idea that you will take care of what you own. If you own a horse or a dog, you aren't going to beat it for no reason. You care about its health because it's better to own a healthy dog than an unhealthy one. And that's similar to the neo-reactionary idea that one of the benefits of a monarchy is that the royal family feels like it owns the country. So it has an incentive to improve the country because then the thing it owns will become more valuable. The real question is when it came to these slaves, were they treated as well as Froude is saying they were? I recently read a book called The Making of the American South, and it goes into the reality of slavery in the southern United States. It did reference this idea, that slave owners cared for their slaves and saw them as part of the family. For instance, quote, "Thomas Jefferson, in 1776, included his family in a list of number of souls in my family. And also, Mary Jones, who was the wife of a planter in Georgia, in 1856, she wrote to her sons that one of their slaves had died. And she wrote, quote, 'You know the tenderness of your father's feelings and his ceaseless anxiety when the servants are sick.' Also, quote, 'Slaves were, in planters' eyes, a race of perpetual children. And as good patriarchs, they had both the right and the duty to discipline slaves firmly, for the same reason that they might put the rod to their own children from time to time.' And this seems more or less in line with what Froude wrote. You might also be surprised to learn that slaves would often get time off at Christmas and in August. It wasn't like a full-time thing. But on the other hand, the reality of this sort of life was a lot darker than Froude ever goes into in the book. This paternalist idea, where the slave owners would take care of the slaves, had more of an impact on planters' self-image than it did on their actual behavior. Slaves were routinely bought and sold, and families were split up. It's hard to argue that those slaves were really treated like family. And the other thing is, slaves couldn't be fired or have their pay docked. So the reality is, when incentives didn't work, violence was used a lot. And in fact, violence was used more often than incentives were in motivating slaves. So the reality is, slavery was complex. There were some factors that are interesting that you can say were maybe in slavery's favor, that of course are never talked about in society. On the other hand, it's not really accurate to say it was this great system where slaves were better off than if they were free. Like many things, it's somewhere in the middle. But that's enough about slavery. When Froude traveled from island to island, he was confronted by a wide variety in the quality of the infrastructure in the islands. And he noticed that the more the whites were in control, the better off the island was. He talked about how Grenada was written about by the French a bit earlier, and when the French controlled the island, it was a thriving place with tons of potential. He contrasted it with what he saw, and he wrote, quote, "The English had obtained Grenada, and this is what they had made of it. The forts which had been erected by the French had been deserted and dismantled. The castle on which we had seen our flag flying was a ruin. The walls were crumbling, and in many places had fallen down. Once there had been a line of wharves, but the piles had been eaten by worms and the platform had fallen through. Round us when we landed were unroofed warehouses, weed-choked courtyards, doors gone and window frames fallen in or out. Such a scene of desolation and desertion I never saw in my life save once. A few weeks later at Jamaica, nature and the dark race had been simply allowed by us to resume possession of the island." And he found similar conditions in Haiti. Quote, "The landing place was or had been a jetty built on piles and boarded over. Half the piles were broken. The planks had rotten and fallen through. The streets were filthy and the stench abominable. The houses were of white stone and of some pretensions, but ragged and uninviting. Paint nowhere, and the woodwork of the windows and verandas moldy and worm-eaten." And he later writes, quote, "The wild African black is not filthy in his natural state. He washes much as wild animals do, and at least tries to keep himself clear of vermin. The blacks in Jacmel appeared to lose the sense which belongs to them in their wild condition. Quote, "The boulevards were littered with the refuse of the houses and were foul as pigsties, and the ladies under the parasols were picking their way along them in Parisian boots and silk dresses." And later on, quote, "Immorality is so universal that it almost ceases to be a fault. For a fault implies an exception, and in Haiti it is the rule. Young people make experiment of one another before they will enter into any closer connection. So far, they are no worse than in our own English islands, where the custom is equally general. But behind the immorality, behind the religiosity, there lies active and alive the horrible revival of the West African superstitions, the serpent worship and the child sacrifice and the cannibalism. There is no room to doubt it. A missionary assured me that an instance of it occurred only a year ago within his own personal knowledge." And about Jamaica, he wrote, quote, "We have a population to deal with, the enormous majority of whom are of an inferior race. Inferior, I am obliged to call them, because as yet, and as a body, they have shown no capacity to rise above the condition of their ancestors except under European laws, European education, and European authority, to keep them from making war on one another. They are docile, good-tempered, excellent and faithful servants when they are kindly treated, but their notions of right and wrong are scarcely even elementary. Their education, such as it may be, is but skin-deep, and the old African superstitions lie undisturbed at the bottom of their souls. Give them independence, and in a few generations they will peel off such civilization as they have learnt as easily and as willingly as their coats and trousers." From quotes like that, you might think that Froude was a racist or a race realist, that he thought that some peoples were at their essence more intelligent, more capable of civilization, or just fundamentally different. You'd be wrong, though. Froude spells it out pretty conclusively. Quote, "Having heard the craniological and other objections to the supposed identity of the Negro and white races, I came to the opinion long ago in Africa, and I have seen no reason to change it, that whether they are of one race or not, there is no original or congenital difference of capacity between them, any more than there is between a black horse and a black dog, and a white horse and a white dog. With the same chances and with the same treatment, I believe that distinguished men would be produced equally from both races." So you do have to remember that this was before all of the IQ research was done, and before we learned about all the scientific differences between the races. But it is interesting, because he really was a racial egalitarian, And it kind of pushes back against that idea that I've heard in the alt-right that basically everybody in the 1800s and earlier was a race realist. Clearly that's not the case. The big difference in his perspective from the average normie today is that he sees civilization as something that's hard to obtain. It's something that we shouldn't be throwing away lightly. And I think that's one of the ultimate solid legacies of books like this, is that we have to remember that there's more to right-wing thought than things like race and the Jewish question. There's lots of really solid points about civilization and what it means to be part of this giant society, a legacy of thousands of years, and trying to preserve that when so many people are ready to throw it away because they don't really appreciate what it takes to build something like this. That's it for this video, and that's it for the Bow of Ulysses. If you'd like to vote on what book we cover next, sign up on Patreon. There's a link in the description. As always, thanks to the patrons, and I'll see you guys next time.